it really took a long time for me to be able to read the water and break this big river down into much smaller rivers. And once you have the ability to look at this large painting and take just one little stroke of the brush out of it, that's when your success really starts to double.
Welcome to the Destination Angler Podcast, the podcast for anglers who travel. And I'm your host, Steve Haigh. We go right to the source, the local guides and experts, to build your knowledge of top fishing locations around North America. It's a big world out there. Now go and fish it.
I'm going away for a while, but I'll be back soon. Whoa, whoa.
Today, our destination is Livingston, Montana, and the historic Yellowstone River. The Yellowstone is known the world over as a top blue ribbon fishery, and for good reason. Starting in the thoroughfare region of Yellowstone National Park, this river offers over 120 miles of quality trout habitat, prolific hatches, and drop-dead gorgeous scenery. It's no wonder anglers flock to the Yellowstone to test their mettle against trophy Yellowstone browns, rainbows, and cutthroat trout. And our guest is Josh Edwards, guide, author, and Yellowstone River expert with ChillinCharters. Josh books his trips through Yellowstone Angler, which is an outstanding outfitter right in the area. Josh is a graduate of Appalachian State University with a degree in advertising and marketing, and he's written several short stories that were published in the Angler's Journal and the Fly Fish Journal. A North Carolina native, Josh has made it his lifelong pursuit to dial into the Yellowstone River and show his clients Montana fly fishing at its best. And Josh is here to enlighten us on the amazing fishing opportunities the Yellowstone River has to offer. Josh, good to have you on the show.
Hey, thanks, Steve. Thanks again for having me.
Yeah, you bet. Hey, so you're out fishing today. How's the fishing been? It's a little hot out there right now, isn't it?
Yeah, we've been going through a heat wave. You know, interestingly enough, this is kind of adverse to how it usually fishes, but the mornings have been fairly slow when the water's still cold. And as things heat up through the day, the grasshoppers on the bank become more active. And that hopper bite in the afternoon has really been our main focus. So the fishing between, maybe 11:30 in the morning till about 5 o'clock in the afternoon has been exceptional.
Oh, that's great. Now, do you switch up your trip start times in situations like that? Like if I wanted to leave a little bit later to hit the main bite, do you guys do that?
Yeah, absolutely. We typically talk to our customers, a day or two or the night before a trip. And, I think that really depends on who's coming to fish, how serious they are about the trip. A lot of times people are out here with their family for vacation, so maybe they can't change the time.
Yeah.
But I think guys that are really focused on the fishing, they seem to be willing to change the time.
Okay, I see. Well, hey, let's start with Southwest Montana. So, obviously a mecca for fly anglers. What is it about this part of the world that makes it such a mecca? Oh, man.
Where to begin? I think overall it's just the amount of water. Southwest Montana has an endless amount of water. If you were to live here, in your entire life and fish a different stretch of river every day, I don't think you could even scratch the surface on what's out there.
Wow.
I think that's the main draw for me personally. I love this area of Montana because it is where the mountains meet the prairie. And for me personally, I grew up in North Carolina and fairly forested area. So I have a real love for the prairie and the open air and open spaces, and living in that transition, where we have a great deal of mountains right here by Livingston, Paradise Valley area down to Yellowstone Park, and then some other mountain ranges to our north. We feel basically surrounded by mountains, but yet the prairie is just a short drive away.
Yeah. Oh, that's really neat. Well, okay. So tell us about the Yellowstone, right? So it's a big famous river. It's what is the longest undammed river in the lower 48, 700 miles long. What is it that makes this river so famous and such a great spot for fly anglers?
I think the thing about the Yellowstone is it just gets under your skin. It's such a large river. It's quite a bit larger, in its width and depth and sometimes even flow than a lot of the other rivers in the area. And I think that has a lure that, I can't necessarily put words on. However, anyone who spends time floating the river definitely seems to be captivated by it. And I think that ultimately, coming to the Yellowstone and being able to fish here, the fishing is important. we're all here to catch fish, but, secondly, the scenery here and just the ability to kind of disconnect to a lot of things is the most important aspect that we have. And I think that that's truly what gets people, fired up about coming to the Yellowstone and coming back year after year, is that, it's this large river and it's constantly evolving and changing. And even though you might be extremely familiar with one stretch in a year, potentially the very next year after spring runoff, that stretch of river has changed immensely. So we're constantly evolving and learning with the river, which from a guiding standpoint is a lot of fun.
Yeah. Yeah. And I've also read and talked to guides that said it's really kind of a lifetime pursuit to really understand this river. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I would second that. I think that, anyone who says that they have this place figured out probably hasn't spent enough days here.
Yeah.
Ultimately, it will serve up a warm dish of humble pie. And I think that that's, for me personally, that's one of the main reasons that keeps me going back. That the Yellowstone, it has its way to, really bring you in and tantalize you with these great numbers of fish, great sizes of fish. And then essentially the very next day, you might be doing everything you can to get one.
Yeah.
So it definitely has that ability to turn off and on. But I think that, the pursuit and the overall hunt is really what keeps me coming back.
Right. And you're fishing what, 100, 120 miles of water in both directions from Livingston? What's your range, so to speak?
Yeah. So essentially, if guys are based here in Livingston, you're going anywhere from the town of Gardiner until, potentially like Big Timber area.
Okay.
Which is east of Livingston on I-90.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the main range of river. There is also trout down by Billings, even that far east, but the numbers really start to decline as the water warms.
Okay, I got you. What about down by Columbus where the still water comes in? Is that start to decline down there?
Yeah, I think there's an overall decline of trout populations, but there's certainly trout down there as well. And there's guys that that are down there and they're fishing quite a bit. But I think for your great trout water, what we would consider in Montana, a blue ribbon trout water,
right?
Basically from Gardiner to Big Timber is kind of the main focus.
Yeah. So I was in Colorado earlier this summer and came across this really cool app called Trout Routes. If you've ever looked for a good map to help you with anything from public access to finding the best trout streams in a given area, I highly recommend checking out Trout Routes. Trout Routes has mapped out each and every trout stream by state, covering public land access, places to camp, hiking trails, stream flows, bridge access points, boat launches, fly shops, and even interactive elevation charts. And you can download maps for offline use. Today, they cover 7 states, including Colorado and the Driftless region in the Midwest. Hey, we did a show on the Driftless a couple of months ago. And good news, they're working on a big update to add 7 new states, including Montana, Wyoming, and Michigan. So if you have an upcoming trip or looking to explore nearby streams, I suggest you check out Trout Routes today on your Apple or Android phone. Hey, can you talk about sort of the character of the water as it flows from, Gardiner down there? Like, what are the major sections? How do you kind of break it down?
Yeah, so I think the first section would be basically from Gardiner all the way to put in called Joe Brown. And Joe Brown is basically, the reason I say that is Joe Brown is located right above Yankee Jim Canyon. And Yankee Jim Canyon, if you are ever going to float and fish that, I think it's advisable to do it in a raft. There is some whitewater in there. It's not uncontrollable whitewater, but it's more than what you would want to go with in a drift boat. But yeah, so that first section, Gardiner area to Joe Brown is fairly flat, riffle run, big deep pool to a flat, then a wave train riffle run into another deep pool. It's losing a little bit of elevation, but the elevation loss in that section is not extremely great. So there's certainly some waves, but for the most part, it's really straightforward from an oarsman's standpoint. And as far as fishing is concerned, primarily cutthroat on dry flies.
Huh.
We're really lucky that section, above Yankee Jim Canyon is a real stronghold for Yellowstone River cutthroat. Now, there are definitely plenty of rainbows and browns up there as well, but it does seem like, at least from my experience in fishing there, the majority of the fish you're going to catch in that stretch are going to be cutthroat. And that's a stretch that we typically target with dry flies.
Okay. And then from there?
And then basically, you have Yankee Jim Canyon that flows from Joe Brown all the way to above the next put in, which would be Carbella. And at Carbella, you're from there all the way to Carter's Bridge, which is right here by Livingston. That is all Paradise Valley. And that's a large, I guess I should say, that's a large swath of water. I mean, we're talking almost, 40 miles of river. But that's typically what people refer to that section as, fishing in the valley. In the valley, the water characteristics are also fairly flat. There are definitely some sections where there's some waves and some elevation loss. But for the most part, it's flat water. And I think that, the dry fly fishing in there can be really fantastic depending on the time of the year. But you can also have a great day of nymphing or even streamer fishing depending on the time of the year. And then as you get below Carter's Bridge, you get into what we consider the town stretch. So that would basically be Carter's Bridge down to Highway 89 North. And that's about a 9.5-10 mile stretch of river. And that stretch of river is really big water. There's a lot of elevation lost in there, and the river kind of chokes down into a much more narrow channel.
Okay.
So it has this illusion of quite a bit more water, even though it's the same amount as the valley. It's just, it's choked down, a little bit smaller river channel, so it seems faster.
Yeah.
And I think that's also a great stretch of water, but certainly a stretch of water that people need to go into with someone who's been in there before. If a guy was wanting to come out to the Yellowstone and do a do-it-yourself trip, that's not necessarily the place I would get started.
Yeah.
It lends itself to a little bit more dangerous rowing with hydraulics and waves.
Oh, wow.
As you get down below Highway 89 North, basically from there, the river in the town stretch, right below Mayor's Landing, which is another put in between Carter's and 89, the river has flown north all the way from Yellowstone Park to Livingston. And at Livingston, just below Mayor's, it turns and it flows east. And so basically from Highway 89 North, you're floating east, and that goes all the way down to Big Timber. And that water is a kind of a mixed bag. There are certainly some stretches that are more flat, like Paradise Valley, and there are other areas that, tend to have larger waves or a choke in the river where everything kind of comes together and there's a wave train and a hydraulic. So it's really a fairly mixed bag as far as flow and river navigation is concerned.
And do the trout numbers change a lot in these different sections and size of fish? Is it different?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that overall, that section from Gardiner down to Joe Brown, the average size of fish is going to be anywhere from 12 inches to 16 inches. Now, you might see a fish in that stretch of water that's 18. You might see 5 in a day that are 18 or better. But primarily, I think the average size is going to be, the 12 to 16 inch range.
Okay.
And as you get into Paradise Valley,
good size.
Yeah, it's a great size fish.
Yeah.
Plenty of fun. I'm happy with that any day.
Yeah, absolutely. Take that all day.
And then I think once you get into Paradise Valley, it really becomes a mixed bag. You could catch, you could go on a day nymphing and see 10 whitefish, which is a subspecies that exists here in the Yellowstone. They are in the trout family, but they're not a trout. They are also kind of a great sign of a cold water fishery. They require much colder, much cleaner water than trout. But let's say you're floating in Paradise Valley and you're nymphing, you might see 10 whitefish. Let's say you get 4 rainbows ranging in size from 10 inches to 16, a few cutthroat in that same range. And you might even see a brown anywhere from 14 inches up to, 19 or 20 inches.
Yeah.
And there are certainly browns that exist in that water that, go anywhere from 20 inches to 26, 27. I mean, that's a rarity, but they do exist.
Wow.
Yeah. And I think as you get into town, it's kind of more of the same. It's a really mixed bag. There's a great number of small fish, great number of average fish, and definitely some larger fish as well. And as you go east, it seems like the water starts to warm and there becomes less fish. I think that through there being less fish, you sometimes can have maybe the rainbow population down there, every single rainbow seems to be an inch or 2 inches bigger than the rainbows you were catching in town. But I think on average, the size is basically the same.
Okay. What are some of the bigger size fish that you tangle with every year? You get some browns in the 20, 25 inch class?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I don't see a lot of them. I wished I saw more than I did.
Yeah, right.
Don't we all? But yeah, I think every year seem to land a handful or half a dozen, 20 to, 22 and a half inch fish.
Yeah, nice.
Anything over that is a really special occasion. I mean, it can happen for anyone. I mean, it's pretty funny. I've had some folks that some of the biggest fish I've caught on guided trips have been with people that have very little experience fishing whatsoever.
Yeah.
And I think that's the beautiful thing about the Yellowstone is you don't know until you go. And if you have a positive attitude and you fish with a positive attitude and you keep a good head about you and knowing that any one of the fish that eats your fly could be a giant, it could happen. I mean,
yeah,
they are definitely in there. I think that the other thing is there's a good chance that you might hook one or see one coming to eat your dry fly and you pull it away from them or something like that. But at least you got to have that encounter, right? They still exist. You got to see it. They're there, but a big fish doesn't get big for no reason.
Yeah.
I think that, if we were to have a place in mind that you could go and catch a 2-foot brown on every cast, I'd be number one in line to go.
Yeah. Yeah. Years ago, my dad used to fish the Yellowstone a lot. And I talked to his guide a couple of months ago, and he told me the story. He said that they hooked a really nice fish. And as it was coming in, it looked like this fish had a beard. It's like, what is on this face of this fish? And when they got it in the boat, it had 4 grasshoppers busted off in its jaw.
No kidding.
Yeah. And he was, my dad was so excited about that fish because, of course, he landed the big one that broke off 4 other guys' flies. So,
I would love to have that encounter.
Right.
And yeah, speaking of that, I mean, there's definitely been times where I've pulled flies out of fish's mouths and, or, there was a cut piece of line in there or, that it definitely happens. I mean, and I think that one of the things that we can take away from that is that ultimately that just means that catch and release fishing is working.
Yeah, right. I guess so. Yeah. I guess catch and break off fishing is working anyway.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. So when you wake up in the morning and you've got some clients waiting for you at the fly shop or wherever you're meeting them, how do you decide where you're going to go with all this amazing water around you?
That's a great question. I think that's the one thing that I struggle with in the guiding aspect more than anything is just, where do I want to go today? It's almost like you could essentially have all the places written down on a pair of dice and throw them on the table and go with that just as well as you could say, all right, this is the stretch I'm going to do. I look at the day of the week and I also talk to the anglers about their ability.
Okay.
If a person has never spent much time with a fly rod in their hand or any time at all, I don't want to go to a stretch of river that's going to be extremely fast water. Because, in those stretches where the water's fast, you got to have a fairly accurate cast to the right spot at the right time. And we're working together as a team to achieve that. However, if you've never done it, then that becomes difficult. So I think that slower, more mellow water is certainly lends itself to a beginner. So that has a lot to do with my decision is just based on, angling ability. And also if they do know how to fish, what's your preference? Do you want to fish dries? Are you only hunting one big fish and you want a streamer fish? Are you okay with nymphing just to catch, a decent number of fish? I mean, those are all things that I want to discuss, first thing in the morning just to kind of figure out what my base is.
Okay.
And once I have that established with the customer, then, we can go to another with all that information. I can look at everything and say, okay, I can go here, here, here.
Yeah.
And then ultimately my final decision is based on how the fishing has been. And that's only, I only know that because I'm lucky enough to be able to guide here and fish here. And I spend, every day on the water.
Right.
So that has a lot to do with my decision as well. Once I have narrowed down, to a few spots, I say, all right, so do I want to go to, Carbella to Point of Rocks? Well, maybe last week I was in there and it was a little bit tougher than going, from Pine Creek to Carter's or maybe, doing gray out of mallards was really good, 4 or 5 days ago when I had other folks that were beginners. And so I want to go back in there and do that again.
Give it a shot. Yeah.
Yeah.
So have you gotten pretty good at sizing up your clients? I mean, do you have people that say, yeah, I'm pretty good, and they get out there and they're having trouble, with a 15-foot cast?
Yeah. I think that ultimately happens, but, I try to be really positive and if that does happen, offer up, a few suggestions on what we can do different. I mean, ultimately my goal is to, at some point, have taught something. I mean, that's why I'm there.
Yeah.
So if a guy has limited experience, but maybe tells me in the morning, yeah, I do this all the time. And we get out there and I realize that, yeah, maybe he does do it all the time, but his style of fishing or what he does on his home water is totally different than what we do here.
Huh.
Then that's when that's when we get to shine as guides and really break down, here's what you can be doing different with your casting. Here's what we try to achieve here with our drift. This is, the water where the fish live, because it's a really large river and the fish live in certain spots. They're definitely not everywhere.
Yeah, that's great. And how many miles do you typically cover in a day of rafting?
It really depends on the flow. And the flow is something that, we can check online through USGS every day and get a good read on how fast the river is moving. So let's say we're fishing, right after spring runoff and the river has just cleared and it's 10,000 cubic feet per second. Well, I mean, if you don't know much about water measurements, that would mean nothing to you, but that's a good amount of water.
That's a bunch.
Yeah. And there's certainly times where we're fishing and the river is that high. So in that time, and when the river is moving at that rate, we might float 20 miles.
Oh, wow.
Just to fish hard for 6 to 8 hours. We might have to cover 20 miles. But as the river, starts to drop, basically from, mid-July to October, I'm floating anywhere from 9 to 12 miles a day.
Okay.
That's a lot of water to cover.
Yeah, it is.
And if you're fishing effectively and you're rowing hard, everyone's in the game, everyone's pretty happy with that distance. I mean, that's a lot of fishing time.
Yeah. And when the water's real big, when it's up around 8, 9, 10,000, I mean, is that just a whole lot of extra rowing for you to keep up?
Yes and no. I mean, I think that the water's definitely moving. Crossing the river from right bank to left bank is a lot more work. But once you're fishing and at that flow, you're pretty much fishing to the bank. That's the only place that has slow enough water to catch fish.
Right.
So you're throwing tight to the bank. You don't have the boat very far off the bank. And so I think the rowing, just back rowing to slow it down for a fishing speed is about the same as it would be at any flow. It's just the crossing and also, getting into areas where the river pinches. And in any area where the river pinches and what I mean by that is the width of the river starts to narrow. That's when you run into bigger water, because the water has no place to go but up. And so at 10 grand, I try to avoid areas that really narrow down and become quite fast and ultimately at 10,000 dangerous.
Right. Oh my gosh. What's the flow now?
So yeah, I'd have to look, but I think it's around 2,000.
Oh, wow. Okay.
It's really low actually this year. And I think that's indicative of we had a really strong snowpack, but it got really warm and it stayed warm and hot. And it's been really hot the last few weeks here, and the water just seems to, have receded, and it's going to continue to recede. And some of that is based on, irrigation and canals and things that are coming off the river
right.
as well. But I think, we're at a flow now that we're probably going to stay anywhere from 2,000 to 1,500 from now until middle October.
Sounds kind of nice.
Yeah. It's nice that it finally leveled out.
Right. So talk about public access and wade fishing, particularly if it's low like this. Are there opportunities to wade fish?
There are opportunities to wade fish. I think the one thing that needs to be said is that we've kind of already covered is the Yellowstone is an extremely large river. It's definitely set up as more of a boat fishery because of its extremely large nature, but you can wade fish it. And I think going to the state mandated fishing access sites and accessing the river at those sites, and either wading right by the site or, utilizing the high water mark here that we have here in Montana, which basically means if you access the water on public land, whether that be a bridge crossing or state land, and you enter the water and you basically stay in the water or on the rocks right by the water, below where the high water mark line is in the spring, you can walk upriver as far as you'd like. Now,
yeah,
on the Yellowstone, that is difficult because walking upriver, you might be walking in ankle deep water, and then all of a sudden it starts to get deep, and the next thing you know, you're standing at a 15-foot deep hole.
Oh my gosh!
So I think that wade fishing here is difficult because of that.
Yeah, got to watch it.
Yeah, you really need to watch it. But I also think that, if you're coming wade fishing here, you got to be okay with, I drove my car to this spot and there's one really good inside bend of a transition where, it's really shallow and goes into deep water, and I can fish that for 45 minutes. And then I need to get in my car and drive to the next put in where there's a big boulder I can fish by. So you almost have to kind of turn this really large river into a much smaller river and really dissect it into areas where you're going to catch fish in that spot. So fish that area, but there's no reason to go stand on the bank next to a hole that's, 10 foot deep and cast in there a bunch. It's just, there are certain areas, like I said, certain areas where the fish are. And if you can focus on that, fish it for an hour or two, and then get in your car and go to the next good spot. That's probably the best way to wade fish this river.
Okay. Keep moving.
And definitely the most safe way.
Yeah. Have you done much fishing on the Yellowstone up in the park, up towards the lake or beyond?
Yeah, I've never fished the thoroughfare. That's something that's on my list. And
yeah, me too.
Really close friend of mine that lives in Cody, Wyoming. He guides in there a little bit, and he's always sending me photographs, and I am just totally obsessed with the idea of going in there. However, for me personally, if I'm going to go in there for multiple days, I want to do it with horses.
Yeah, is that right? Yeah.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of bears back there.
Right.
And I think that, if you're going to go out there and sleep in your backpack bivvy and eat over a jet boil, that's not necessarily my idea of a great time in what might be the most serious grizzly country in the lower 48.
Well, it's the most remote area in the lower 48 is the thoroughfare, I read. And they say that the loneliest job in America is the park ranger in the thoroughfare district.
Yeah, man, what an amazing job that would be. Those guys are amazing.
Yeah, you're right, for the right guy. So thoroughfare, it's on our wish list. And then you come off the lake, and there's different sections in the park, too, that you can fish. Some are closed off, some are open. Is that right?
Yeah, so if you're ever going to fish in the park, and specifically the Yellowstone River inside of Yellowstone Park, you want to look at the regs book they give you when you buy a fishing license. And there are certainly areas that are closed, and there are areas that are open. I have fished up by Lee Hardy Rapids, which is kind of the famous upper Yellowstone fishery. And it's gone through waves of really good fishing and really poor fishing. Currently, it's back on the rise from what I've been told, and what little bit of fishing I've been able to do up there seems to be the case. There's a fair number of fish. There's not a crazy abundance of fish in that stretch, but the ones that are there, they're really, really nice.
Okay.
There's some extremely large fish in there. Now, getting them to eat, that's a totally another ballgame. And ultimately, the one thing I have noticed in going up there and fishing, it's very similar to the Yellowstone anywhere, and that is it's difficult to find a good area to wade because of the amount of volume that the river has, and it's a really deep channel there. And there are certainly gravel bars and shallow areas where you can get out and fish, but there's a lot of really good looking water that is just inaccessible.
It's just hard to get to.
Yeah.
How's the wildlife viewing, all down through the system? Like even in Paradise Valley, do you see moose, elk, deer, whatnot?
Yeah. I mean, throughout the years, I've seen pretty much everything. I've seen black bear. That's extremely rare that you might have a black bear come across. As a matter of fact, I was out with a guy last week and single angler. We were eating lunch and kind of had our heads down, and he looks up and I still had my head down, and he said, "Is that a dog?" "Oh man, that's a bear." And before I could get
Oh,
my,
geez.
my head up, he knew it was a bear. And it was swimming across the river, basically on a beeline straight for the boat. But the current was pushing him downstream, so we weren't worried that he was going to have enough power to hit us. He was crossing at an extremely wide stretch of river, and yeah, it was great. We got to stay there on anchor and finish eating our lunch, and we watched this bear swim all the way across the river and get up on the rocks and dry off and disappear into the cottonwoods.
That's awesome.
But that's pretty rare. I think been living in Livingston for a decade now, and I've probably seen, I don't know, maybe 4 bears on the river.
Okay.
So it's fairly rare. There are certain areas and also certain times of the year where you're going to see elk. I think later in the fall, once the snow really starts to fly in the high country, that typically pushes the elk further down to the valley floor. So you're more apt to see elk in the late fall.
Okay.
And then plenty of whitetail. And then there are also a few areas where there's some islands in the middle of the river. And for whatever reason, it seems like the moose really like the boggy islands. So there's some areas where we see moose from time to time.
Ah, neat. That's got to be fun. Well, Josh, tell us about yourself. I first met you in 2013. I'd brought my son out there with his, they just graduated from college, and his 2 roommates were willing to go fish with the old man here. And you were our booking guy at the Yellowstone Angler, and you did a nice job connecting us with some guides, and even gave us a tip on a tributary to fish our first night there. So thank you for that. But how did you end up in Livingston working as a guide?
Yeah, so it's kind of a long story, I guess. But my first experience with Montana was with some college roommates of mine. We ultimately did a road trip out here with a 1988 pop-up camper. And we went through southern Wyoming up into the Bighorns, then over to the Winds. And then from the Winds, we went north into Yellowstone Park and spent quite a bit of time in Yellowstone Park fishing some of the rivers there. And then we came out north of the park. And as we were coming out north, we were driving old Tahoe, and we had a fan belt go out on the Tahoe. And so ended up having to hitchhike into town with a guy and got a fan belt, and he got us all squared away and give us a ride back out. And we ultimately ended up getting the truck going again. But I just fell in love with the attitude of the people here on that trip and just the overall friendly nature of Montanans. It reminded me a lot of North Carolina, where I grew up, but with, a great expanse of land and open spaces, and what seemed like at the time and still seems like now, an endless amount of water.
Right.
And once I saw that and experienced that firsthand, it was something that I knew that I wanted to be a part of my life from then on. And so I came back to North Carolina and was going to, still in college at the time. And I sent a resume out to, maybe 6 or 7 different fly shops throughout the West for summer employment. And I heard back from a few and did a few email exchanges with a few of them. And then I ended up doing a phone interview with Yellowstone Angler here in Livingston. And at the time, there was a guy there by the name of Doug McKnight that was managing the shop with George Anderson. And I did a phone interview with Doug, and we hit it off, and he invited me out to work for that summer. And so I came out, I worked that summer, and, just not only worked in the fly shop, but did things that a lot of the other guys didn't have time to do or maybe didn't want to do. But, I chopped wood for those guys for the winter and, clean the bathroom, sweep the floors, like just did anything and everything. I was just so excited to be here and be fishing in this area. And everyone really was super kind and pretty much gave me an open arms invitation. And so I went back and finished up school at Appalachian State that next winter. And the day after I graduated, I loaded up and moved out here to Livingston. And I've been here ever since.
Wow.
Yeah. So I started another summer of work for Yellowstone Angler. And while I was working there that summer, they extended a job for full-time employment, basically running the retail floor. And I did that for about a year. And then I started doing the guide bookings. So basically I was a booking agent for Yellowstone Angler to not only here in Montana, but to some of the destinations that they hosted. And so that, I worked there in the shop for about 4.5 years and was guiding part-time. And I really loved the guiding thing, and I wanted to spend more time on the water, and ultimately was, worked my way up to the point to where, I could guide full time.
Okay.
And I've been doing that ever since.
When you first went out there, did you out there with the intention of becoming a guide?
Yeah. I mean, that was always something that I wanted to do, but, showing up to a place and expecting to guide is not necessarily something that's feasible, and certainly not something that's feasible here on the Yellowstone. So, basically what I did was I spent my time in the shop and my time while I was, off work fishing. All I did was fish for the better part of 10 years. And through that time period, I was introduced to a lot of great fishermen and good people, and spent a lot of time on the water with those people. And I've learned a lot. I think that, through some of the mentors that I've been able to have, and also through just hard work and, putting your nose to the grindstone and learning the hard way, I've been able to get a fairly decent grasp on, all the fishing in this area. And I certainly learn something new every day, but, have a good base of knowledge after those years.
Absolutely. Now, I'm curious, did you ever bump into the guy that gave you a ride into town and then back out to your car? You ever bump into that guy?
No. And I really, that's one thing I really wish I had got that guy's name.
Yeah.
And I'm sure he told me, but, I was a young kid and there was a lot going on, and, we're in a strange place and broke down, and, we're running out of money already. So it was kind of remembering his name was difficult for me. I really wish I'd remembered his name, because I'd love to look him up now and buy him a beer or take him to dinner or something like that.
Right. Yeah, he kind of changed your life in a way, right? I mean,
yeah, in a big way, in a really big way. And I think, I got to give kudos to Doug McKnight when he was working at Yellowstone Angler. I mean, he is the guy that hired me. And then also George and Jamie Anderson at Yellowstone Angler. I've worked with them for a lot of years, and they've always been really good to me, and they're like family. So.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah. What a great guy too. George has sold me some flies once when I was in there. I got to buy some flies from the master there. That was pretty cool.
Yeah.
And you've talked about Livingston to me before the show, about how much you love Livingston and just the community there.
Yeah. It's an amazing small town. I can't give it enough accolades. I think the one thing for me personally, that the reason I really love Livingston is it's through all the growth that continues to happen in Montana, especially in this area. Livingston always keeps true to its core values. It's a hardworking town, blue and white collar. And not only that, but everyone here is looking out for everyone else. Now, we might stay out of each other's way. I certainly don't want to get in my neighbor's business, but if I notice outside that, they're working on something and standing on a ladder, I'm going to go over there and ask them if they need help, or, whatever they might be doing. I mean, that's just kind of the community here. Kids still ride their bikes to go to school, and, we can meet up after work. We can get on our bicycles and ride downtown and meet up with friends and see people, that we don't see through our daily routine, and who we want to catch up with. And, it's just a beautiful place.
That's cool. And you spend your winters somewhere besides the United States, don't you?
Yeah. So for the last 4 seasons, last 4 winter seasons, basically from the day after Christmas until the end of March, I have been going to Patagonia, Chile, which is in southern Chile. And I work for a lodge there called Nick Finn Patagonia. And that's named after the owner, Skip Mullen, named after his son, Nico. So it's kind of, I really love the name of the place just because it's Nico's place. And yeah, we have an amazing fishery there. But aside from the fishery, Skip, who is the lodge owner, has been able to build, relationships with local folks that live there in that region of Chile. And ultimately for me, that's the reason I love to go.
Okay.
The people that live there are just incredible. The way they live, just their ability to carry on day to day with very little and always remain happy and focused on family and the important aspects of life. It ultimately just kind of leaches into your own life while you're there. And I think that, for me, I've been able to grow a lot as a person in going down there.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
Yeah, and then the fishing is incredible. We primarily fish lakes there. They're all spring-fed lakes. We fish them out of basically a pontoon raft with a 35 horsepower jet tiller on the back. So with that motor, we can go anywhere we want to go. Typically, we're using that motor to go upwind. And then while we're fishing, I'm rowing the boat just like I would a drift boat here in Montana. And I'm rowing with the wind, and that basically is our current. And we're throwing to the banks and to structure, and also sight fishing to fish that are either up cruising in the waves and you can just see them silhouetted in the waves, or also, right up against the shore and in 2 foot of water.
Oh, cool. Yeah. What kind of trout they got down there?
Primarily we're fishing brown trout. We do have 2 lakes that have a few rainbows in them, but our primary focus is brown trout. And in the majority of the lakes, we're catching browns that are anywhere from, 16 inches to 18 inches on average, with a shot at a 20-inch fish pretty much every day.
Yeah.
And then there are a couple lakes that we fish where the fishing is a lot more difficult. You might go to this lake and get totally blanked, or you could go to the lake and catch, the biggest fish of your life as far as trout is concerned. And
Wow.
And by that, I mean, they started about 6 pounds. And I think the lodge record out of the lakes that I'm talking about in particular, I think is 19 pounds.
19 pounds. Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. Skip, actually, the owner, he caught a fish that was over 20, but that was in a lake that is more like the ocean. And we don't get to really fish there as much as we'd like to. That's got to be a specific weather day.
I got to get a map out.
Zero wind.
I mean, I got to get a map out. I just don't think Chile is having a bunch of big lakes, but I guess it does.
Yeah. They're really, I think one of the most unique things about the lakes that we're fishing there is all the water is potable. So you could be out in the middle of the lake and grab your Nalgene and scoop up the water and drink it right there on the spot, and you're not going to have any issues. I mean, we don't recommend that for our clients, but we've done it personally. And I've never had one issue whatsoever. There's no beavers, and the livestock is pretty much kept away from the water. So it's pretty spectacular.
Yeah, that sounds neat. Well, I just put that on my bucket list to get down there. I actually got a buddy who lives in Chile, and he's been telling me about the fishing down there. There's some rivers and streams that maybe have never seen an angler in Chile. You can really get back in there.
Yeah, I think with a good truck and calendar of time, you could go to some areas that, like you said, truly have never seen an angler. We've been able to do some exploration down there over the years on our time off, and I've certainly been able. I feel blessed to say this, but I've been able to fish a few of those places, and it's true. I mean, they even act as if they have no idea what a fly is. You throw a fly in the water, you got 2 or 3 fish at a time coming to eat it. That's a pretty amazing sight to see.
That is. Yeah, that is. Well, okay, so let's head back to the Yellowstone for a minute here. Could you take us through the seasons on the Yellowstone? What are you doing in spring, early summer, midsummer, fall? Catch fish? What are the major hatches that you're zeroing in on? That kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that when talking about the Yellowstone, the seasons that might be one of the most important things to discuss. So typically, the first season that we have would be considered our spring fishing season. Now, we're lucky here in Montana, the Yellowstone River never closes, but the weather gets so poor that, no one is really fishing it. And there are certainly winters where it gets so cold and so dark for so long that parts of the river will actually freeze.
Okay.
So as a rule of thumb, I like to talk about spring fishing starting, mid to late March, and that's all weather based. So some years we might be fishing, quite often by the first week of March, because for whatever reason, we're not having a, heavily snow season in March, which we tend to get a fair amount of snow in March and April still. So there have definitely been years where it's been, fairly warm in March and we're fishing, but on average, I think 25th of March to basically end of May, first part of June.
Okay.
And during that spring fishing season, I think it gets started early March, April with Caddis. And then that kind of cycles into, some March Brown hatches. The March Browns, even though they're called March Browns, they always seem to come in April or May. But those are our two primary hatches in the spring as far as dry flies are concerned. We're lucky here on the Yellowstone that it is a really prevalent stonefly fishery. So even through the winter months, if you want to nymph, and through the spring as well, a solid bet always is a Pat's Rubber Legs or George's Gold Bead Stone, or any stonefly pattern that you use on your home rivers is going to work here. And then we like to fish, midges and Baetis nymphs underneath that stone as a 2-fly rig.
Sure.
And then for dries, I think midges, midge clusters, Baetis, and as you move into a little later in the season, May and April, you have a shot at throwing March Browns if you see them hatching.
Yeah.
That's a mayfly. If you're out here and you've never seen a March Brown before, and all of a sudden they start hatching, and you'd heard that name, and you look at the fly, you're going to know, okay, this is a March Brown. It's just a.
What size are those?
They're 16, 14.
Oh, okay, pretty small.
Mayflies with a brown body.
Yeah, and you said a midge cluster. What's a midge cluster?
Oh, so midge cluster, we fish those a lot because they're easy to see. With it being big water, a single small midge, sometimes it gets lost in the film.
Yeah.
Whereas if you run a midge cluster, which might be like, basically on a long shank hook, it's 2 Griffiths gnats tied on the same hook.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
That's a cool
So
idea.
it looks like, 3 or 4 midges bound together mating on the water. And I think that when the fish are really actively midging, especially here, they will go for that bigger meal.
Oh, that's cool. I never heard of that.
And then as the spring goes on, we get a hatch here on the Yellowstone that's probably the most noted or talked about hatch, and that's the Mother's Day Caddis hatch. Mother's Day Caddis hatch can be anywhere from, as far as when it happens on the river. I think, the dates that I've seen it happen the most is probably between the 25th of April to about maybe May 12th, May 15th, in that span of time.
Yeah.
I have a few things to say about the Mother's Day Caddis hatch.
Please.
Number one, it is without a doubt, if you can hit it and it's happening, it is without a doubt the best fishing you will ever see on the Yellowstone.
Oh, wow.
I want to preface that by also saying that it is probably the most difficult hatch to ever hit. I've lived here for about a decade, and I can count maybe 6 seasons where I've had 1 to 3 days of really strong Mother's Day Caddis hatch. And that's, living here, going to check on the river every day, excited about it happening, not really sure when it's going to happen, and really being tapped into the days when it does happen. And even after all that time of 10 to 11 years, only seeing it maybe 6 times.
Well, how is it? Now, how is it? Is it super sporadic? Is it popping around the river and you're just in the wrong spot, or how do you miss it?
It's a water temperature based hatch. So basically what we have to have happen, it's a water temperature, and I don't want to misspeak, so I'm not going to say a certain degree because I'm not exactly sure what degree. I have an idea, 50 to 53 degrees, somewhere in that span. Some people will say 48, but the river has to hit a certain temperature and the bugs will start to hatch. Now, if you've ever seen photos of this hatch, there are times where there are so many coming off the water that they're literally floating down the river like large blanket and what we call mats of caddis.
Sure.
And that is really daunting because ultimately there's so many flies on the surface of the water. For that fish to pick out your one dry fly,
yeah, good luck.
Is pretty much just good luck, right? But there are the days where it's getting started and the hatch is really starting to get going. Those are typically the best fishing days. But the water's got to get to a certain degree. And typically to get the water to that certain degree is when spring snow starts to melt. So
okay.
What I've noticed happening is the Mother's Day Caddis hatch will really happen for 1 to 2 to maybe 3 days if you're extremely lucky, and then the river blows out with spring runoff. So I think that's why it's so difficult to hit, because you could potentially say, okay, these are the dates it's going to happen. I'm coming on these days. And then for whatever reason, it was, 65 degrees for 4 days straight and the river blew out before you came. Or it decided to snow again and the river temperature dropped another 10 degrees and it's snowing and we're fishing Baetis when we should be fishing Mother's Day Caddis. So I think from an angler standpoint, it's a hatch that you almost have to live nearby to enjoy. Even living nearby, you might miss it. And I've certainly missed it many times.
Could you tie a Mother's Day Caddis cluster? Give that a shot?
Yeah, you'd want to tie it about the size of a T-shirt, I think.
They're big, huh? Are they big? What size are those things?
No, they're, for me personally, I do like to fish at a little bit larger version, like a 12, but they're 16s when you see them on the water.
Oh, okay.
I like to fish a larger version because I can see it when all the bugs are flying around.
Right. What patterns do you like for that?
Elk hair caddis, Goddard caddis,
standard
sparkle,
stuff.
caddis pupa, like just your standard caddis flies are going to be the best. I really like elk hair caddis with a tuft of white or orange or chartreuse on the top. That way, when your fly is amongst 40 others, okay, hey, that's mine. And you're watching that fly specifically.
Okay.
But I don't want to spend too much time focused on that hatch per se. But I think that it's one that, let's say you're planning a spring trip here and you just happen to be here when it happens.
Get out there.
You're going to see the best fishing of your life.
Oh my gosh.
But to hit that is, that'd be like hitting the lotto. But the other spring fishing is really great. And I think for guys that are into hunting, anything from 17 to maybe 22 as far as brown trout, that'll chase a streamer. The spring is a pretty good time to do it. They're less pressured. They are more lethargic in the cold water. So to get a chase seems to be sometimes more rare than others, but they've just made it through the winter. So I think they're trying to pack on a few more pounds. And there are certainly overcast days where, the fish seem to be on the feet really hard. And you can have great streamer fishing in the spring. You can have great days when it's overcast of, blue wing olive or what we call here Baetis dry fly fishing.
Sure. Okay. What about getting into past runoff? What do you do? What is it? Mid-June, July? What are you doing then?
Yeah. So runoff pretty much lasts from maybe the last second, third week of May until the last week of June on most years. There are exceptions to that where, we don't have a really good winter. We don't have a lot of snowpack and it gets hot quick and then we're in a drought cycle. But on average, we have an average snowpack and we have average spring weather. The river is going to clear to a fishing level around the 25th of June. It might be June 20th. It might be June 28th, but we'll use the 25th as a rule of thumb.
Okay.
From that time period until the first week of July, our primary focus are stoneflies. We have 2 extremely prolific hatches as soon as the river starts to drop, and those being salmon flies and golden stones. Everyone in Montana and anyone who has fished in the West, I think gets absolutely, giddy and excited when the name salmon flies is suggested.
Yeah.
While we might not have the hatch that you would find on the Madison or the Big Hole or the Gunnison, we do have a fair number of salmon flies. And there are certain years where the river clears up when those bugs are hatching and the fish are on them. And there are some years where the water is still high that last week of June. And for whatever reason, the water's still off color enough to where the fish don't really get on them. But if you have a foot of visibility, which is how we gauge the river just by looking at it in the spring after runoff, if it is green in color, and you can see, let's say you're standing in a foot of water and you can see the bottom, that should be enough clarity for the fish to get keyed in on salmon flies. So the first few days that the river clears, we're going to be fishing subsurface with either black woolly buggers, yuck bugs, girdle bugs, anything that has, just a giant leggy imitation tight to the bank or 5 feet off the bank. And we're going to fish those until we start to see the adult flying around and in the bushes. And once you start to see the adult salmon flies, then you can throw it. I have had mixed results. And I think anyone that has tried to fish salmon flies here on the Yellowstone will say the same thing. There are certain years where the clarity is better than others, and they're really paying attention to the adult. And I also think that every year let's say typically we have about 5 days where the salmon flies are around. In that 5-day period, there are going to be 2 days where the fish are just going nuts for them. On the front side of that, they will have not seen the flies enough to really pay much attention. Then there's a 2-day period where they've seen them, they know what they are, and they're really keyed into them. And then there's a couple-day period where the flies are still everywhere, but the fish seem gorged, where they've actually eaten so much. And if you catch them as they're getting close to that stage, you'll notice in handling them that they have just a giant bulge in their stomachs, and they feel lumpy and crunchy, and it's actually really weird, but they're just gorging themselves.
Right.
Because they have spent, a month and a half in muddy water, and they've eaten very little. And so this is their first shot at protein. It'd be like, if we were on a desert island for a month and a half, and all of a sudden we have, a giant steak dinner floating by us at every single place we look. Ultimately, we're going to take a bite at some point.
You're going to grab it.
Yeah. And then we're going to eat so much of it that we make ourselves sick to where we're not going to eat anymore. So the salmon flies, like I said, June 25th to that first week of July. And typically in that time frame, there are going to be a few days that are just ultimately better than others. However, if you're out here and those bugs are around, it doesn't really matter a lot of days how the fishing is, because it's such an amazing experience just to see them flying around and in the bushes. And I can promise you this, that if you happen to be fishing with a guide, he's probably going to be fairly excited about it.
Yeah. Oh, that's neat. What about moving into midsummer? What are you doing? What are you doing then?
So then I think we start to segue into golden stones, yellow sallies, some caddis, and that's going to be from that first week of July until, around maybe July 20th to somewhere in that time frame, where golden stones are extremely prevalent. And there are, like I say, there's going to be PMDs, there's going to be yellow sallies, there's going to be caddis. So you can fish an array of different mayflies along with fairly large, stone flies, and all that's going to work. And I think the one takeaway from that time of the year is that the fish are on the feet. They have been subjected to a lot of time without flies, without bugs, and a really prolific food source. So when those hatches start to take place, you really see the fish behavior change, and they're eating really well. So I think anybody who comes here and is fishing here for the month of July, on average, it's the Yellowstone. It's a moody, extremely fickle river, but on average, July, you're probably going to have fairly decent fishing.
Okay.
That's kind of the time where the fish are really just packing on the pounds. They're eating hard, and they're close to the bank and in good spots to catch them.
Seems like July is good just about everywhere out west. It's just a good month.
July is just it's a really good month. And then after those golden stones and yellow sallies and caddis and everything starts to slow down, we're very lucky here on the Yellowstone, with it being such a stonefly prolific river, that we actually have another hatch of stoneflies referred to as the nocturnal stone. And those are stoneflies that hatch at night. And while we don't see them in the day as much as we do the golden stones or the salmon flies, they are around. You'll see their exoskeletons, or what we call their shucks, lining the banks on the rocks that are closest to the water. You'll see where they emerged the night before. And the fish really key onto those. I think cloudy days or mornings of low light, that's typically when that nocturnal bite is best. But they're definitely keyed into that. And then as we segue on into, the last week of July, really all of August, until the bitter end of August, we start focusing on hopper fishing. We're lucky enough here on the Yellowstone, there's a lot of grassland right here by our river. And the thing that goes hand in hand with the dry, arid landscape and grassland is grasshoppers. And the fish love them. So we're really lucky here that we get to tie on a giant piece of foam and sometimes send it right down the middle of the river and catch them.
Oh my gosh. Is that right? Huh.
Yeah. Yeah. There are definitely areas and, certain depths where it doesn't matter if it's 4 foot deep on the bank and it's 4 foot deep on the middle, there's probably fish in both spots and you can fish that dry to both. Yeah.
What patterns do you like for your hoppers? What's your favorite?
There's a couple patterns here locally that I think are some of the ones that I tend to fish more. Number one, the sweetgrass hopper, and that's originated by a guy named Doug McKnight, who I mentioned earlier. His fly is really good. There's another guy in town by the name of Eric Paramore, and he ties a fly called the Thunder Thighs. That fly is a really great fly. Another classic Yellowstone hopper is the pink pookie. That was tied by a guy named LJ Little John, who he's kind of local legend. He's tied all sorts of flies, but that pink pookie of his really works great. And I think a standard hopper like a Moorish hopper or a grand hopper, your more generic hopper patterns are going to work. They work just as well. And I think it's funny, every now and then I'll be fishing with a guy that's anywhere from 65 to 80. And he's like, well, I used to fish the Yellowstone 20 years ago. We loved the Joe's hopper. To be honest, that deer hair Joe's hopper, there's days where it works just as good as any piece of foam.
Why not? Yeah, that's
exactly.
Cool. Well, just for all the listeners, we will try to get some pictures of these fly patterns out on the Destination Angler Facebook page. So check that out after you listen to the episode. Those are some great tips, Josh. Okay, so after hoppers, then what? We're in the fall, and what are you doing then? Betas or?
Yeah, the fall is a mixed bag. As we get into the fall, it's really, again, it becomes more weather dependent on the fishing. If it's overcast and cloudy, then the Betas is the primary attraction. There's going to be areas of foam and back eddies where there's a lot of fish uprising. On the move, you can fish a larger Betas dry to a Betas dropper and have success with a dry dropper setup in fairly skinny water. And then again, guys that are really excited about targeting a big fish, they tend to come here in the fall and throw streamers, and it's a great time to do that. There are a lot of fish to be caught. I will say that, again, as with anything on the Yellowstone, but some days are better than others. You might come here, and if you're truly committed to getting a big one, you might come here and fish all day hard for one fish. You might fish all day hard for 6 to 8 fish.
Yeah.
But, there's no guarantees, and you got to put your time in and really fish hard to catch those larger fish.
Yeah. Like you said, that's how they got big.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that's what we all want as far as if you're into this, more predator style fishing where you're fishing large streamers or, you're targeting an aggressive reactionary bite. That's something that doesn't happen in every situation. So you got to keep fishing it, keep putting it in the good spots, and ultimately through perseverance and positivity, it's going to happen.
Right. Now, speaking of good spots, talk about the keys to success on the river. So if someone were walking to a fly shop where you worked and, the guy was looking for some words of wisdom, what would you tell them? What are the keys to success to being successful here?
Yeah, I think there's a couple areas that people really should focus on. And that is not to be overwhelmed by the size of the river. And that takes time. It took a lot of time for me personally. I mean, I grew up fishing rivers the width of a dinner table, much less as large as the Yellowstone. So it really took a long time for me to be able to read the water and break this big river down into much smaller rivers. And once you have the ability to look at this large painting and take just one little stroke of the brush out of it, that's when your success really starts to double. Because what you're doing at that point is you're pinpointing a certain area and fishing that area. And Stephen, we were talking in the past, I shared a piece of advice that a friend of mine gave me, a buddy that I fish with all the time, and I guide with him. His name is Paul Block. He's based here in Livingston as well. But I remember years ago, we were cutting our teeth guiding together and doing a lot of fishing together. And I remember one time I had this rig on, right? And I think we were fishing, under an indicator with dead drifting, and I had 6 foot of a line out, or underneath the bobbers rather. My setup was for basically 6 foot of depth. I was just getting, crabby because the bite wasn't all that great. And I started throwing it, in 2 foot of water, 1 foot of water, and he just looks at me and he's like, my nickname is Jed. He's like, "Hey, Jed, you have to fish your rig." And I think that that's a great piece of advice. So let's say we're set up with a dry dropper, and our dropper is 18 inches below our dry fly. And if we're fishing that in 10 foot of water, then maybe a fish eats the dry, but your dropper is certainly not being effective whatsoever. With 18 inches of dropper, you want to go and you want to focus on the areas of the river that are anywhere from a foot to 3.5 foot deep. You fish your rig in those areas. You don't throw your rig in 20 foot of water, because you're not set up for 20 foot of water. And I think that once he explained that to me, and we had been doing it, but it wasn't like a general practice to where it was something that I was dead focused on. And I think that was a huge game changer for me as far as, fishing my rig. And that's also with guiding. If I'm set up for a certain depth or a certain way, I'm only going to fish those areas where that is productive.
Yeah.
So I think that that's huge. If you're going out fishing and you're going to, throw a deep nymph rig, then great, but focus on the areas where you're in deep water.
Where that's going to work.
And it sounds silly to verbalize all this, but I think it's something that's it's an afterthought, and it's really overlooked.
Yeah, you fall into that trap. You've got your rig and you're like, I'll throw it in here. I know it's not perfect, but I'm too lazy to switch it up. And you're saying, what, you're rowing by sections of water sometimes because in 5 minutes, you're going to be into another area that fits your rig. Is that right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, I might skip something that looks extremely juicy, but that ain't our water. We're not set up for that, right? So, going to the next spot that maybe doesn't look as good, but has the elements that we're set up for, is going to be a lot more successful. I think on a big river like this, it's really easy to get lured in by the water because it all looks so good, right? So you end up almost beating yourself down just trying to fish it all, when if you just break it apart and you fish those areas, you're going to have a lot more success.
Dive a little deeper into what you do when you're reading water. So seams, foam, what else are you looking for?
Yeah, number one, seams on the side of the current, where fast water touches slow water. And I want my flies right on that fast water edge. Also foam. As everyone says, foam is home.
Mm-hmm.
The reason foam is home is because if the foam is collecting there, it's a general understanding through hydrology that ultimately all the flies, all the food, all the bugs are going to end up in that same spot, right?
Yeah.
So if you throw your flies in that mix, generally the fish are going to be there, and your flies can be right in front of them by fishing that foam. I think looking into on the Yellowstone specifically, and this is certainly no secret, but the transitions of the river, they seem to be areas where the fish love to congregate, where it goes from extremely shallow to deeper water.
Mm-hmm.
Going off of, it's referred to a lot of different ways, the shelf, the pour over, the inside, or whatever, but ultimately transitions, where it comes from, fairly shallow water into fairly deep water. And that's just a spot where a fish can, sit under a ledge, exert very little energy, but also quickly get to the food. And those spots always have fish for that reason.
That's some good tips. I wanted to ask you about something else too. Just conservation of handling fish. You and I talked before the show about that, and you had some strong thoughts or opinions about how to do that. You want to talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, here on the Yellowstone, especially, it's incredibly important that we take care of the fish, once we catch them. The whole goal is to go out and catch a few fish. And while that might be in good practice, you're ultimately stressing them by catching them. So once you've hooked a fish and you're fighting it and getting it into the boat, I think the most ideal situation is to net that fish. And then after the fish is in the net, leave the net basket in the water, still allowing that fish to breathe, I almost think of it as like having my own personal aquarium where I keep the rim of the net above the water so the fish can't swim back out, but I don't take the net and bring it into the boat and bring the fish into the boat. I just let the fish stay in the water until we're in a position to where I can get off the oars and unhook the fish and then release it as quickly as possible. With that being said, you're ultimately going to catch a fish. And if you're coming here on vacation to fish, you're going to want some photos of the fish that you catch. So I think number one, there's really no reason to take a photo of every fish you catch, but the special fish that you catch, whether that's a certain species or a certain size that you're targeting, then yeah, by all means, I think it's great to take photos and document your trip and take those home and show your loved ones or friends and fishing buddies. But I think, netting those fish and getting either pull over to the edge of the river and stop to take the photo is really important, because then you can allow that fish to be in the water the entire time. You never have to bring it inside the boat. You can then let the angler wet his or her hands. I like to unhook the fish either while it's still in the water, or I quickly, wet my hands, grab the fish, unhook it, put it back in the net in the water, let it, regain its thoughts and breathing. And then quickly what I do is I allow the angler to hold the fish, like I said, with wet hands. And what I really like to do is have the other person on board take the photo, and I stay below the angler with the net in case the fish flops. You can catch it with the net, go right back to the water instead of, letting it hit the deck of the boat or you start hugging it. It sounds, it's funny. There's been a lot of press in recent years about keep them wet. And I think that's a really awesome movement. And I don't want to come across as, someone on my soapbox or anything like that. But I think that a conscious, really good effort to keep the fish wet is really not a bad idea. That's a cool thing.
Not a bad idea at all. So you're talking about just a couple of seconds out of the water, right? I mean, you're talking about just lifting it, taking a picture, and getting it right back in the water. You're talking about a couple seconds.
Yeah, I'm talking a couple seconds at the most. And it's really easy to do that. And I think that, if you have a fish that you really are dead set on getting a photo of, then that fish is worth pulling over and anchoring the boat and then getting a photo of. And I mean, there are certain situations where that's not, that option's not available. You're in heavy water or whatever. And in that case, you have to unhook the fish quickly. And again, with wet hands, one photo and then right back into the water, and I think that, I think social media is a great thing for fishing and driving people to the sport. But I also think that sometimes through those channels, it kind of muddies up what's really important.
Yeah.
And I think that, ultimately we'd all be lying if we said we didn't want a photo of a giant brown and us holding it. I mean, everyone that fishes wants that photo.
Right.
And I think that, that's great. We should be doing that, but we got to do it responsibly.
Yeah, that's great points. I really like that. Just shifting gears for a minute, I wanted to ask you, you had mentioned some people throughout the podcast, guys like Skip Mullen, George Anderson, Paul Block, a few other guys. It sounds like you've got you're one of these people that really allows other folks to pour into you. Like you appreciate that. You like the advice. And I'm just kind of wondering what these people mean to you.
Yeah. I mean, these guys ultimately are like brothers to me. All the guys that, I've talked to or talked about, and there's certainly other ones that just I haven't mentioned that I have spent a lot of time fishing with and a lot of time growing with as an angler and as a person. And I think through time, your friendship becomes more like family. And a lot of these guys are basically family to me. And I think in fishing, that common bond is something that really drives that.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, good for you.
There's been a handful of other, mentors where I've just learned, a lot about fishing, right? Like we were talking about Doug McKnight. I mean, that guy is like an encyclopedia of fly fishing information. The person that I probably learned the most about rowing a boat from, this guy that I guide with all the time here in Livingston, Marcus McGuire. I mean, I remember times when I was cutting my teeth in rowing this big river, and he was the first person to step up and say, "Hey, that's not necessarily the way you want to be doing this. You got to do this or do that. And I really value the guys that don't just, for me personally, the guys that I build the strongest relationships with and continue to spend time with aren't always the guys that just agree with me. You know what I mean?
Right.
I really like the fact that there are some people that are like, hey, actually, this is the way you should be doing this. And I'm not ignorant enough to think that I know everything. So I like to listen. And ultimately that's a great relationship builder.
That's cool.
Being able to take pieces and parts from everyone.
Yeah, that's really
and
good.
My goal is hopefully at some point I've offered something to each one of those people as well.
Oh, I bet you have. Absolutely. All right. Let me ask you one more thing here about the area you're in. Like, what are some of the local watering holes that you'd recommend for the hungry, thirsty fishermen at the end of the day?
Yeah, absolutely. We all tend to know a few of those. I think, here in Livingston, the absolute best place to go is probably the Murray Bar.
Okay.
That is the fisherman's bar. They also have dinner there. It's really cool for fly fishermen. If you're here in Livingston, you can stop in there and they have these things that's called the bar flies. There's a lot more of them that actually aren't on the wall, but there's probably, I don't know, maybe 30 on the wall of famous anglers and flies they have tied for their photo.
Oh, literally bar fly. I thought you meant like a drink called a bar fly. You're talking about
no.
Okay.
So there's a portrait. There's the portrait of the angler, and then the fly that he tied or her that they have tied for their portrait. And so, for instance, Lefty Cray is on the wall. Jack Garside, George Anderson, John Bailey, Jordan Gage, Tony Valeriano. I mean, there's all these not only Livingston legends, but just fly fishing legends on the wall in there. And I really like that piece of history. And ultimately, if you end up fishing with a guide that lives in Livingston, his favorite place to go see everybody he knows and have a beer is going to be the Murray Bar.
That's the spot.
It is definitely the spot. Absolutely. There's probably been more fishing lies told there than anywhere else.
Yeah, there you
Other
go.
than maybe the Lorelei in Florida.
Well, that's another podcast, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Man, it's great, Josh. It's been great talking to you here. And this is a long show, but I think it was worth it. How can our listeners get in touch with you?
The best way to get in touch with me, as far as, if anyone ever wants to book a fishing trip, Yellowstone Angler here in Livingston is someone that I work with quite often as an outfitter. Also a guy named Max Yezagiri. He owns a business over in Bozeman called Montana Angling Company. And I work for him quite a bit when the Yellowstone is muddy on the Missouri. And then also when the Yellowstone clears here as well.
Okay.
Those are probably the two best contacts as far as getting out in the boat with me. And then as far as contacting me directly, Yellowstone Angler has my information, but if you ever have any questions or just want to reach out, a great avenue is just to get at me on Instagram through direct message. And my name on there is ChillinCharters, and that's Chill, CHILL, N, the letter N, and Charters. And
okay.
That's kind of a play on words that a few friends and I started not too long, about a year and a half ago. And that's, basically just to keep laughing and never take the fishing too serious. There's a lot of things in life that need to be taken serious. And my personal opinion is that fishing doesn't necessarily have to be one of those things.
That's great. Well, I bet you give people a fantastic experience, and it's been great talking to you. We will post this information on our show website and then pictures of those flies that Josh talked about on our Destination Angler Facebook page. If you want to join in the conversation with our Facebook group called the Destination Angler Connection, you can check that out too. And if you enjoy the show, give us a like, share, a follow on Facebook or Instagram, and be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcast. You can email me with comments and suggestions at shaig50@gmail.com. That's shaigh50@gmail.com. If you're a guide and want to be on the show, give me a shout. As always, our music is by our Brothers Fountain. Hope you enjoyed the show, and we will see you again next week.
Well, I'll go from the land to the shining sea. But I know there's more to life than what the eye can see.